Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. On June 27, 1995, the morning sun rose over Mason City, Iowa, casting warm light across quiet residential streets. It was the kind of Tuesday morning where nothing seemed out of place. Children prepared for summer activities, families enjoyed breakfast together, and the small city of 29,000 people went about their routines with the comfortable predictability that defined Midwestern life. The temperature hovered in the mid-70s, perfect weather for a June morning. Birds chirped in the trees lining the neighborhoods. Sprinklers watered lawns. The smell of fresh coffee from kitchen windows. Everything felt safe. Everything felt normal. In an apartment complex on the northern edge of town, a young woman should have been rushing out the door. Her shift at the television station started early, and she was never late. Her coworkers expected to see her bright smile by 4 in the morning. Her loyal viewers anticipated her cheerful voice delivering the morning news. But on this particular Tuesday, she never made it to work. She never made it out of her parking lot, and she was never seen again. The disappearance of Jody Huisentruit would become one of Iowa's most haunting mysteries. A case that started with a missed alarm would transform into decades of questions, countless theories, and a community forever changed by the sudden vanishing of someone they loved. What happened in those early morning hours remains unknown, but the search for answers has never stopped. Jody Sue enters 27 years old in the summer of 1995. She possessed the kind of energy that transformed ordinary moments into memorable ones. Her colleagues at KMT TV described her as a natural on camera, someone who connected with viewers not through polish or perfection, but through genuine warmth. Her smile wasn't practiced. Her enthusiasm wasn't manufactured. When Jody delivered the morning news, people felt like they were hearing from a friend, not a distant television personality. She had thick, blonde hair that she often wore down, framing a face that radiated approachability. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and kindness. Standing at 5 feet tall and weighing just over 100 pounds, Jody had a pipe frame, but her presence filled any room she entered. She dressed professionally for her on-air appearances, but those who knew her personally saw someone equally comfortable in jeans and a t-shirt, someone who valued substance over style. Jody's personality drew people to her effortlessly. She wasn't the type to seek attention for its own sake, yet attention found her naturally. At social gatherings, she gravitated toward making others feel included. If someone sat alone, Jody would sit with them. If someone seemed uncomfortable, Jody would start a conversation. Her empathy wasn't performative. She genuinely cared about the people around her, from the camera operators at the station to the servers at her favorite restaurants to the viewers who recognized her at the grocery store. Her ambitions in broadcasting weren't driven by fame or fortune. Jody wanted to tell stories that mattered to her community. She wanted to inform, to connect, to serve. The morning news shift meant waking up at 3 in the morning, arriving at the station by 4, and being on air before most people had their first cup of coffee. It was grueling work, but Jody never complained. She approached each broadcast with the same enthusiasm she'd shown on her first day. Her coworkers admired her work ethic. Her bosses valued her reliability. Her viewers trusted her. Beyond her career, Jody maintained close relationships with family and friends. She stayed in regular contact with her parents, who lived in Long Prairie, Minnesota, about 2 hours north of Mason City. They spoke on the phone frequently. Jody visited when her schedule allowed. The Huisentruit family was tight-knit, the kind of family where everyone knew they could count on each other. Jody's relationship with her younger sister was particularly strong. They shared secrets, supported each other's dreams, and maintained the special bond that comes from growing up together. Jody's friends described her as loyal and fun-loving. She enjoyed golf and played regularly at local courses. She participated in charity golf tournaments, combining her love of the sport with her commitment to helping others. She attended parties and social events, where her laughter could often be heard above the crowd. She had a boyfriend, and while their relationship had its complexities, as most relationships do, Those close to Jody saw her as someone capable of deep emotional connections. She was also someone who loved life's simple pleasures. A good meal with friends, a beautiful sunset, a round of golf on a perfect day. Jody appreciated moments of joy wherever she found them. Her coworkers remember her bringing donuts to the morning team, a small gesture that showed her thoughtfulness. She remembered birthdays. She asked about people's families. She made the effort to be kind, consistently and without expectation of anything in return. At 27, Jody's future seemed bright and full of possibility. She had established herself in a competitive field. She had earned the respect of her peers and the affection of her community. She talked about her goals, about moving up in broadcasting, about telling bigger stories. She had dreams of traveling, of experiencing more of the world beyond Iowa. She had plans for the future, plans that included career advancement, deeper relationships, and continued personal growth. Nobody who knew Jody imagined that future being cut short. Nobody anticipated that her life would be reduced to a mystery, her face appearing not on the evening news as an anchor, but on missing person posters as a victim. Nobody expected that June morning in 1995 to be the last time Jody would be in control of her own story. The life she had built was exactly the kind of life that should have continued. She wasn't involved in dangerous activities. She didn't have enemies that anyone knew of. She lived a normal life in a normal town, working a normal job, surrounded by people who cared about her. She was admired by everyone who knew her. She was loved by family and friends. She did not deserve what happened to her. But evil doesn't discriminate based on who deserves what. Evil finds its targets in the most ordinary places, during the most ordinary moments. And on that June morning, evil found Jody Husentrud in her apartment parking lot. In a city where people still left their doors unlocked, in a place where everyone believed they were safe. The months leading up to Jody's disappearance seemed unremarkable on the surface. She continued her morning news routine at Kiemt. She played golf with friends. She attended social events. She maintained her relationships. But beneath the surface of this normalcy, small cracks were beginning to appear, cracks that would only become visible in hindsight, when people looked back trying to understand what had gone wrong. Jody had received some unwanted attention in the form of admirers who crossed boundaries. Being a local television personality meant being recognized in public, and while most interactions were pleasant, some made her uncomfortable. There were viewers who developed inappropriate attachments, people who believed they knew her personally because they saw her on their television screens every morning. Most television personalities experience this to some degree. It's an occupational hazard of being a public face, but for someone as kind and accommodating as Jody, navigating these situations without hurting feelings or escalating tensions could be challenging. Some who knew Jody mentioned that she had expressed mild concerns about certain individuals. Nothing specific enough to report to police. Nothing threatening enough to cause alarm. Just the vague unease that comes from realizing someone's interest in you feels slightly off. A viewer who approached her too often. Someone who sent too many letters. A person whose compliments felt more like surveillance than admiration. In the moment, these incidents seemed minor. Jody handled them with her characteristic grace, setting boundaries politely when necessary, but not dwelling on them. Her work schedule itself created a unique vulnerability. Leaving for work at 3:30 in the morning meant walking to her car in darkness. The parking lot of her apartment complex at 2525 North Kentucky Avenue was poorly lit. At that hour, the area was deserted. No neighbors were awake, no traffic passed by. The world was silent and still. Anyone could have observed her routine, noted the exact time she left each morning, understood the isolation of that moment. Predators often study their targets, learning patterns and identifying moments of maximum vulnerability. For Jody, that moment occurred every single weekday before dawn. Her apartment complex was typical of its era and location. Multiple two-story buildings arranged around parking areas. Stairs leading to second-floor units. The kind of place where young professionals lived, where people came and went without much interaction. Neighbors might wave hello but didn't necessarily know each other's names. This anonymity provided privacy, but it also meant that unusual activity might go unnoticed. Someone lurking in the parking lot at 3 in the morning wouldn't necessarily trigger suspicion or intervention. There were no security cameras, no night security guards. Just an ordinary apartment complex in an ordinary city, where crime was rare enough that extensive security measures seemed unnecessary. Jody's red Maserati sat in her assigned parking space. She loved that car. It was sporty and fun, reflecting her personality. She kept it clean and well maintained. Every morning, she would walk down the exterior stairs from her second-floor apartment, cross the parking lot, unlock her car, and drive to the television station. The routine was consistent. The timing was predictable. Anyone watching would have known exactly what to expect. In the weeks before her disappearance, some people noticed Jody seemed slightly stressed. The pressure of her job, combined with personal relationship dynamics, weighed on her. She was dating someone, and like many relationships, theirs had moments of tension alongside moments of happiness. There were also rumors, later investigated by police, about other men who had taken an interest in Jody. Some of this interest was reciprocated, some was not. The details of her personal life, which seemed private and inconsequential at the time, would later be scrutinized for any possible connection to her disappearance. But despite these underlying tensions and minor concerns, Jody's life continued normally. She showed up for work. She fulfilled her responsibilities. She made plans for the future. On June 26, the day before she vanished, Jody spent time with friends. She seemed happy. She laughed. She talked about upcoming events. Nothing about her behavior suggested fear or awareness of imminent danger. That evening, Jody attended a golf outing. It was a fundraiser event, the kind of community gathering she enjoyed. She played golf, socialized with friends and acquaintances, and stayed later than planned. She was having fun. The weather was beautiful. The company was good. When the event wound down, Jody headed home to her apartment. She had to be up early for work the next morning, but that was routine for her. She'd done it hundreds of times before. Jody arrived home around 11 o'clock. She parked her Miata in her usual spot. She climbed the stairs to her apartment. She unlocked her door and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. Everything was as she'd left it. She prepared for bed, set her alarm, and settled in for a few hours of sleep before the early morning wake-up call that defined her professional life. But something went wrong with her alarm. Whether it malfunctioned, whether she accidentally set it incorrectly, whether she turned it off in her sleep, nobody knows for certain. What is known is that Jody didn't wake up at her usual time. She didn't leave her apartment at 3:30. And when 4 o'clock arrived and Jody hadn't shown up at the television station, her coworkers grew concerned. This was completely unlike Jody. She was never late. She was reliable to a fault. If something prevented her from coming to work, she called. She communicated. She didn't just fail to appear. The producer on duty that morning, seeing the clock tick past 4:15 with no sign of Jody, felt a knot of worry form in his stomach. He called her apartment. The phone rang. Jody answered. She sounded groggy, confused. She'd overslept. She couldn't believe it. She was so sorry. Immediately. She would be there as soon as possible. The producer heard genuine distress in her voice. Jody took her job seriously, and this mistake clearly upset her. But mistakes happen. The producer assured her it was okay, told her to drive safely, and prepared to cover her segments until she arrived. Jody hung up the phone and began rushing to get ready. She pulled on clothes quickly. She grabbed her belongings. She didn't take time for makeup beyond the basics she could apply in the car or at the station. She was focused entirely on getting to work as fast as possible. She hurried down the stairs from her second-floor apartment. She crossed the parking lot toward her red Mazda Miata. The parking lot lights cast weak yellow pools of illumination across the pavement. Beyond those pools, darkness stretched in every direction. The summer night was warm and still. Jody reached her car. She carried her belongings, likely her purse and work materials. She was probably thinking about the broadcast, about what she'd missed, about how to catch up when she arrived. Her mind was on work, on responsibility, on getting to the station. She wasn't thinking about danger. Why would she? This was Mason City, Iowa. This was her home. This was her parking lot. This was supposed to be safe. But someone was waiting in that parking lot. Someone who had been watching. Someone who had planned. Someone who had chosen this moment. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Jody barely had time to react. Evidence later found at the scene suggested a violent struggle. The attack occurred right there, next to her car, in the pre-dawn darkness. Jody fought. She fought hard. But she was 5 feet tall and weighed just over 100 pounds. Her attacker was stronger. Her attacker was determined. Her attacker had the element of surprise. The sounds of the struggle went unheard. The apartment complex remained silent. Nobody looked out their window. Nobody called police. The violence happened in a bubble of isolation. A pocket of darkness where evil could operate without interruption. Jody's screams, if she managed to scream, were swallowed by the night. Her resistance, fierce as it may have been, was overcome. And then she was gone. Taken from that parking lot. Taken from her life. Taken from everyone who loved her. The Mazda Miata remained at the parking lot. Evidence of the struggle surrounded it. But Jody herself had vanished. Between the phone call to the station at 4 o'clock and the moment her coworkers arrived at her apartment less than an hour later, Jody Huisentruit had been abducted. The transition from normal life to absolute horror had occurred in minutes, maybe seconds. One moment she was rushing to work, apologizing for being late, thinking about the day ahead. The next moment she was fighting for her life. And then she was simply gone. The world wouldn't know what happened for hours yet. As Jody was being taken, Mason City slept peacefully. As whatever horror was occurring unfolded, people dreamed in their beds, unaware that someone they saw on television every morning was in unimaginable danger. The sun would rise on June 27, 1995, revealing a beautiful summer day. But it would also reveal evidence of a violent crime that would haunt Iowa for decades. Jody's coworkers waited at the television station. 4:30 came and went. 5 o'clock approached. The morning broadcast had to continue, so they made adjustments, covering Jody's segments themselves. But concern deepened with every passing minute. This wasn't like her. Even if she'd overslept, even if she'd rushed, she should have arrived by now. She lived only a few minutes from the station. The drive was straightforward. What could possibly be taking so long? At the station, producer Amy Kunz felt increasingly worried. Something was wrong, she could feel it. Jody's voice on that fall had been rushed but normal. She'd been apologetic about oversleeping but ready to fix the situation by getting to work immediately. There was no indication of any other problem. Yet she still hadn't arrived. The absence felt ominous. Around 6 o'clock, with Jody still missing and the morning broadcast proceeding without her, coworkers made a decision. They would drive to her apartment and check on her. Maybe her car had broken down. Maybe she'd had an accident. Maybe there was some simple explanation. But they needed to know. They needed to see with their own eyes that she was okay. When they pulled into the parking lot of Jody's apartment complex, they immediately saw her red Mazda Miata. It was parked in her usual spot. The driver's side door was open. Jody's personal belongings were scattered on the ground nearby. Her shoes, her blow dryer, her earrings. Items that should have been in her hands or in her car were instead strewn across the pavement. The hood of the car was cold, indicating it hadn't been driven recently. Key marks scratched the car's surface, suggesting a struggle or impact. The scene was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Jody's coworkers stood in that parking lot, staring at evidence that their friend and colleague had not simply overslept or had car trouble. Something violent had occurred here. Something terrible. The scattered belongings told a story of interrupted action, of violence, of things being dropped or torn from someone's grasp. The open car door suggested Jody had reached her vehicle but never made it inside. The cold hood confirmed what they feared, that whatever happened had happened right here, in this parking lot. Before Jody could even start her car, one of them ran to alert authorities. The others remained at the scene, too shocked to process what they were seeing. This was supposed to be a welfare check. This was supposed to end with finding Jody safe, maybe embarrassed about falling back asleep or dealing with some minor crisis. Instead, they were looking at what appeared to be a crime scene. They were confronting the reality that their coworker, their friend, the person they'd just spoken to on the phone hours earlier, was missing under violent circumstances. The Mason City Police Department received the call at approximately 6:30 in the morning. Officers were dispatched immediately to 2025 North Kentucky Avenue. When they arrived and assessed the scene, they understood instantly that this was serious. This wasn't a missing person who'd wandered off. This wasn't someone who'd left voluntarily. This was an abduction. This was a crime scene. And the victim was Jody Hoysentrut, a beloved local news anchor whose face was known to virtually everyone in Mason City. The police officers who arrived at Jody's apartment complex that morning moved quickly to secure the area. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the parking space where the red Mazda Miata sat with its door hanging open. Officers instructed the small group of Jody's co-workers to step back, to avoid contaminating potential evidence. The parking lot, which moments before had been just another ordinary space in an ordinary apartment complex, had transformed into the center of what would become one of Iowa's most intensive criminal investigations. Detective J.D. Smith was among the first investigators on scene. A veteran of the Mason City Police Department, Smith had worked numerous cases over his career, but nothing quite like this. Missing persons cases in Mason City were rare. Violent abductions were virtually unheard of. As he surveyed the scene, taking in the scattered belongings and the open car door, he felt the weight of what this case would demand. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence could be crucial. The first hours of any investigation often determined whether it would be solved, and the clock was already ticking. The physical evidence painted a disturbing picture. Jody's white leather shoes lay on the pavement, separated from each other, as though they'd been kicked off or pulled from her feet during a struggle. Her blow-dryer rested near the car, its cord tangled. A pair of earrings glinted in the morning sunlight. Her key was found near the vehicle, bearing what appeared to be a partial palm print. These weren't items carelessly dropped. These were belongings scattered during violence, during chaos, during a moment when Jody's hands were no longer free to hold onto them. The car itself showed signs of impact. Scratches marred the paint on the driver's side. A small dent suggested something or someone had struck the vehicle with force. The positioning of these marks, combined with the scattered belongings, helped investigators begin to reconstruct what had happened. Jody had approached her car. She'd likely had her keys in hand, her belongings gathered, ready to get in and drive to work. Then someone had attacked her. The struggle had been brief but violent. Items had fallen or been torn from her grasp. The car had been struck during the altercation. And then Jody had been taken away. Investigators searched the area surrounding the parking space for additional evidence. They found drag marks on the pavement, subtle scuff patterns that suggested a body or heavy object being pulled across the ground. These marks led away from Jody's car toward the area where another vehicle might have been parked. The implication was chilling. Jody had been dragged, likely unconscious or incapacitated, from her own car to a waiting vehicle. Her abductor had then driven away with her, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness before anyone witnessed what had occurred. Officers canvassed the apartment complex, knocking on doors, asking residents if they'd seen or heard anything unusual in the early morning hours. Most people had been asleep. The few who'd been awake hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. No screams had been heard. No sounds of a struggle had penetrated the walls of the surrounding apartments. The attack had been swift and silent enough to avoid drawing attention, or perhaps the ambient noise of air conditioners and the natural sound insulation of the buildings had simply masked whatever sounds Jody had made. One neighbor did provide a potentially significant piece of information. They'd heard what sounded like a scream around 40 in the morning. At the time, they dismissed it as perhaps someone being startled or kids playing. The sound hadn't repeated, so they'd rolled over and gone back to sleep. Now, in the context of Jody's disappearance, that scream took on horrifying significance. It might have been Jody's voice, calling out for help in her final moments in that parking lot. It might have been her last chance to alert someone to what was happening. But the sound had been too brief, too ambiguous, and by the time anyone understood its meaning, it was far too late. The timeline investigators pieced together was precise and damning. Jody had called the television station at approximately 4 o'clock, reporting that she'd overslept. That call established she was alive and in her apartment at that time. Her co-workers arrived at her apartment around 6:30 to find the crime scene. This meant the abduction had occurred sometime between 4 and 6:30, most likely closer to 4:30 based on the neighbor's report of a scream. The window of time was narrow, perhaps as little as 30 minutes from when Jody hung up the phone to when she was taken. This narrow timeline told investigators something important about the perpetrator. The attack had been opportunistic in one sense, taking advantage of Jody's vulnerable moment in the parking lot. But it also showed planning and awareness. Someone had known Jody would be coming to her car in the early morning darkness. Someone had positioned themselves to intercept her. Someone had waited, watching, ready to strike the moment she appeared. This wasn't a random act of violence by a stranger passing through. This was targeted. This was intentional. As morning progressed and word through Mason City that Jody Huizentrout was missing, the community's reaction was immediate and intense. People who'd watched Jody deliver the news every morning felt personally connected to her disappearance. She wasn't just another missing person. She was someone they knew or felt they knew. Her face had been in their homes every weekday. Her voice had been part of their morning routine. The idea that someone could snatch her from a parking lot in their safe, quiet city was almost incomprehensible. The television station where Jody worked became a focal point for both media attention and community grief. KMTV staff were devastated. They'd worked alongside Jody. They'd shared meals with her, joked with her, relied on her. The morning broadcast that day was somber as anchors reported on their colleagues' disappearance, their voices heavy with emotion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jody should have been delivering this news. Instead, she was the news. Instead of reporting stories, she'd become the story. Tips began pouring into the police department. People reported seeing suspicious vehicles near Jody's apartment complex. Others claimed to have information about individuals who'd expressed interest in Jody. Some tips were credible and required follow-up. Others were well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful. A few were from attention seekers who had no real information but wanted to insert themselves into a high-profile case. Investigators had to sort through everything, pursuing each lead while maintaining focus on the most promising avenues of investigation. Jody's family received the devastating news that morning. Her parents, Imogen and Maurice Huizentrout, were at their home in Long Prairie, Minnesota when they learned their daughter was missing. The phone call from authorities shattered their world. Jody was their daughter, their child, and now she'd vanished under violent circumstances. They immediately drove to Mason City, desperate for information, desperate to help, desperate to believe this nightmare would end with Jody being found safe. The Huizentrout family's anguish was palpable. Jody's mother, Imogen, couldn't process what she was hearing. Her daughter was responsible, careful, loved. How could this happen to her? Jody's father, Maurice, struggled to maintain composure, wanting to be strong for his family while grappling with the horrifying reality that his daughter had been taken. Jody's sister dealt with her own crushing grief and fear. The family clung to hope that Jody would be found, that whoever took her would be caught, that this ordeal would end. As investigators continued processing the crime scene, they called in additional resources. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation sent agents to assist. The FBI was contacted and began monitoring the case. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. The violent abduction of a television news anchor was the kind of case that demanded extensive resources and expertise. Everyone involved understood that time was critical. The first 48 hours of a missing person investigation are crucial. After that, the chances of finding the victim alive dropped dramatically. Forensic technicians meticulously documented every aspect of the scene. They photographed the scattered belongings from multiple angles. They measured the positions of items relative to the car and to each other. They collected everything as evidence: the shoes, the blow dryer, the earrings, the key with the partial palm print. They took samples from the car's surface, looking for trace evidence that might identify the perpetrator. They made plaster casts of the drag marks on the pavement. They searched for fibers, hair, blood, anything that might provide a lead. The red Mazda Miata itself was carefully examined, and then transported to a secure facility for more detailed forensic analysis. Investigators hoped the car might yield fingerprints, DNA, or other trace evidence from the attacker. They processed the interior and exterior thoroughly. They examined the scratches and dent for any material transfer that might indicate what had struck the vehicle. Every inch of that car was scrutinized for clues. Searchers fanned out across Mason City and the surrounding area. Volunteers joined law enforcement in combing through parks, wooded areas, ditches, and abandoned buildings. They searched for any sign of Jodi or evidence related to her abduction. Helicopters circled overhead, observers scanning the ground below for anything unusual. Boats searched the Winnebago River and other bodies of water. The search was exhaustive, driven by the desperate hope that Jodi might still be alive, that she might be found before it was too late. But as hours turned into days, that hope began to dim. There was no ransom demand. No one called claiming responsibility. No witnesses came forward with definitive information about what had happened or who had taken Jodi. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of violence in that parking lot and a community desperate for answers. The media descended on Mason City. Local news stations covered the story extensively. National media picked it up as well. The disappearance of a young, attractive television news anchor made for compelling coverage. Jodi's face appeared on television screens across the country, not as the anchor delivering news, but as the subject of breaking news bulletins. Her photograph was distributed widely. Missing person posters went up throughout Iowa and neighboring states. Anyone with information was urged to contact authorities. Investigators began the painstaking process of examining Jodi's life for any clue as to why someone might target her. They interviewed her co-workers, asking about any unusual interactions Jodi might have mentioned. They spoke with her friends, trying to understand if she'd expressed concerns about anyone. They contacted her family, gathering background information and trying to identify anyone who might have held a grudge or developed an unhealthy obsession with her. The interview with Jodi's boyfriend was among the first priorities. In cases of missing women, romantic partners are always persons of interest, simply because statistics show that women are most often harmed by people they know intimately. Jodi's boyfriend at the time was cooperative with police. He provided his whereabouts for the early morning hours of June 27th and agreed to answer any questions investigators had. While he remained a person of interest as the investigation continued, initial indications didn't point to his direct involvement in Jodi's disappearance. Detectives also looked into other men who'd expressed interest in Jodi. Being a television personality meant receiving attention, and not all of it was welcome or appropriate. Investigators learned about viewers who'd sent Jodi letters, some expressing admiration that crossed into concerning territory. They identified individuals who'd approached Jodi in public more frequently than seemed normal. They compiled a list of anyone who might have developed an obsessive interest in her. One name that came up repeatedly in the early investigation was John Vances. Vances was a longtime friend of Jodi's, someone she'd known for years and considered a close confidant. He was significantly older than Jodi, in his late 50s at the time of her disappearance. The two had met through social and professional circles in Mason City. Despite the age difference, they'd developed a friendship that appeared on the surface. Jodi visited Vances's home. They played golf together. They talked on the phone regularly. But some who knew both Jodi and Vances sensed that his feelings for her went beyond friendship. They noticed the way he looked at her. They heard the way he spoke about her. There seemed to be an intensity to his attachment that made some people uncomfortable. Jodi herself appeared to view Vances as a friend and mentor figure, someone she could talk to and rely on. Whether she recognized or reciprocated any deeper feelings he might have had remained unclear. On the morning of Jodi's disappearance, Vances became a significant person of interest for a specific reason. Phone records showed that Jodi had called him the previous evening, on June 26th, at approximately 7 o'clock. The call had been brief. Investigators wanted to know what they'd discussed. More importantly, they wanted to know Vances's words during the crucial hours when Jodi was abducted. When police interviewed Vances, his account of that morning raised questions. He stated that he'd been at home alone during the time of Jody's disappearance. He had no alibi, no one who could verify his location. He claimed he'd been sleeping and hadn't left his house until later in the morning. When asked about his relationship with Jody, Vances described her as a dear friend, someone he cared about deeply. He expressed shock and concern about her disappearance. But investigators noticed things about Vances's demeanor and responses that struck them as unusual. He seemed nervous, more nervous than innocent concern might explain. Some of his answers felt rehearsed or overly specific. He volunteered information that hadn't been requested, a behavior that sometimes indicates someone trying to establish an alibi or deflect suspicion. He also made statements about Jody and their relationship that suggested a deeper emotional investment than simple friendship. Police asked Vances to take a polygraph examination. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court and aren't definitive indicators of truthfulness, but they can be useful investigative tools. Vances agreed to the polygraph. The results were inconclusive on some questions and showed deception on others. When confronted with these results, Vances maintained his innocence. He insisted he had nothing to do with Jody's disappearance. He claimed he wanted to help find her. But the polygraph results, combined with the lack of alibi and the nature of his relationship with Jody, kept him firmly in investigators' sights. Detectives obtained search warrants for Vances's home and vehicles. They were looking for any evidence connecting him to Jody's abduction. Forensic teams went through his house methodically. They examined his cars. They collected samples for DNA analysis. They searched for any of Jody's belongings, any signs of a struggle, any indication that she'd been brought to his property. The searches yielded some items of interest, but nothing that definitively proved Vances's involvement in the crime. Among the items seized from Vances's home were personal photographs of Jody, more than one might expect from a casual friendship. There were also cards and notes that suggested emotional attachment. Investigators found a videotape that Vances had made at a party attended by Jody, footage that seemed to focus extensively on her. These items painted a picture of someone who was perhaps more invested in Jody than she was in him, someone who might have harbored unrequited romantic feelings. But having strong feelings for someone and abducting them are vastly different things. The evidence against Vances was circumstantial. There were no witnesses placing him at Jody's apartment complex that morning. There was no physical evidence directly linking him to the crime scene. His palm print didn't match the partial print on Jody's key. No forensic evidence from his home or vehicles conclusively connected him to the abduction. Without more concrete evidence, investigators couldn't arrest him. Vances maintained his innocence throughout the investigation. He hired an attorney and eventually stopped cooperating with police, exercising his right to remain silent. This decision, while legally sound, fueled suspicion among those following the case. Why would an innocent person stop helping investigators find a missing friend? But Vances's attorney likely advised him that continued cooperation, especially without clear evidence of innocence, could only create more opportunities for his words to be used against him. The focus on Vances didn't mean investigators ignored other possibilities. They continued pursuing multiple leads simultaneously. They looked into registered sex offenders in the area, checking alibis and investigating anyone with a history of violence against women. They examined recent crimes in the region, looking for patterns or methods that might connect to Jody's abduction. They followed up on tips about suspicious vehicles seen near Jody's apartment complex in the days leading up to her disappearance. One theory investigators explored was that Jody's abductor might have been stalking her for some time before striking. The specific timing of the attack, occurring right when Jody was unusually late and rushed, suggested knowledge of her routine. Someone familiar with Jody's schedule would have known she normally left for work around 3:30. They would have been surprised when she didn't appear at the usual time. But they might have stayed in position, waiting, hoping for another opportunity. When Jody finally emerged from her apartment after 4:30, they were still there ready. This theory raised questions about how long the perpetrator had been watching Jody. Had they observed her from a distance for days or weeks? Had they studied her habits, learned her vulnerabilities, planned their attack carefully? Or had they been someone with legitimate access to her life? Someone who knew her schedule because she'd told them. Someone who didn't need to stalk because they were already part of her world. The investigation also considered the possibility of multiple perpetrators. The drag marks and the apparent speed with which Jody was taken from the parking lot suggested this could have been accomplished more easily by two people than by one. One person to overpower Jody, another to bring a vehicle into position and help move her. The absence of prolonged noise or witnesses might indicate a well-coordinated attack. However, this theory complicated things. Multiple perpetrators meant multiple people keeping a secret, and secrets among criminals often unravel over time as loyalties shift or consciences nag. Detectives interviewed employees at the television station extensively. They wanted to know if anyone at KMT had shown unusual interest in Jody. They asked about station security, about who had access to the building, about whether anyone would have known Jody's schedule in detail. They investigated whether any coworkers might have harbored resentment toward Jody for professional or personal reasons. The interviews revealed that Jody was well liked at the station. There were no obvious workplace conflicts, no coworkers emerged as suspects, but the interviews did reveal that Jody's morning routine was no secret. Anyone at the station knew she arrived around 4 o'clock each weekday. Her schedule was predictable and publicly observable. Someone who wanted to target Jody wouldn't have needed inside information. They could have simply watched the station, noted when she arrived, and followed her home one evening to learn where she lived. From there, establishing her departure time would have been as simple as sitting in the apartment complex parking lot on a few different mornings and observing. This realization was both helpful and frustrating for investigators. It meant the perpetrator didn't necessarily have to be someone close to Jody. It could have been a stranger, someone who developed an obsession with her from afar, someone who'd never appeared on anyone's radar as a person of interest. But it also meant the pool of potential suspects was enormous. Anyone who watched KMT's morning news could have become fixated on Jody. Anyone in Mason City or the surrounding area could have seen her in public and developed an unhealthy interest. As the investigation progressed through those first critical days, the evidence was carefully cataloged and analyzed. The partial palm print on Jody's key went to forensic experts for comparison against known prints in criminal databases. The drag marks were photographed and measured. Fibers collected from the scene were examined under microscopes. Every piece of physical evidence was treated as potentially case-breaking. But forensic analysis takes time, and while technicians worked in laboratories, investigators continued pressing forward with interviews and surveillance. The community of Mason City rallied around the search for Jody. Vigils were held. Reward money was offered for information leading to her safe return. Local businesses posted her picture in their windows. Churches prayed for her during services. The outpouring of support demonstrated how deeply Jody had touched people's lives, even those who only knew her through the television screen. She represented something important to the community, a sense of connection and normalcy that her absence had shattered. But beneath the public displays of hope and solidarity, a darker reality was settling in. The longer Jody remained missing, the less likely it became that she would be found alive. Statistics on abduction cases were grim. When a woman is taken by force, especially in a violent attack like the one evidenced in Jody's parking lot, the outcome is rarely positive. Investigators continued working and might still be rescued, but privately, many were beginning to prepare for the worst. Jody's family maintained a public presence, making appeals for anyone with information to come forward. Her mother Imogen appeared at press conferences, her face etched with anguish, begging whoever had taken Jody to let her come home. The sight of a mother pleading for her daughter's safe return moved the community deeply. People who'd never met Jody or her family felt personally invested in the case. The emotional toll on the Huizentrout family was immense, made worse by the lack of answers. Days stretched into weeks, and the intensive search for Jody continued without producing the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. The Mason City Police Department, working alongside the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the FBI, pursued every possible lead. They conducted hundreds of interviews. They processed thousands of tips. They searched vast areas of terrain. But Jodi remained missing, and the person or persons responsible for her abduction remained unknown. The forensic analysis of evidence from the crime scene proceeded methodically. The partial palm print lifted from Jodi's key was compared against prints in law enforcement databases. Investigators hoped for a match that would identify the perpetrator immediately. But the print quality was insufficient for definitive identification. It could potentially exclude suspects when compared directly, but it couldn't independently identify an unknown perpetrator. This was disappointing but not unexpected. Partial prints are notoriously difficult to work with, and the circumstances under which this print was left, during a violent struggle, likely compromised its clarity. The fibers collected from Jodi's clothing and from the area around her car were analyzed. Forensic technicians identified several different fiber types, some consistent with common clothing materials, others potentially from carpeting or vehicle interiors. These fibers were cataloged carefully. If investigators ever identified a suspect and could obtain items from that person's home or vehicle, the fibers might provide crucial corroborating evidence. But without a suspect to compare them against, the fibers alone couldn't solve the case. DNA technology in 1995 was far less advanced than it would become in later years. The sample collection and analysis procedures were more limited. Investigators collected biological samples from the crime scene, but the processing was slow and the results often less conclusive than what modern DNA testing could provide. Still, they preserved everything carefully, understanding that technology would improve and that evidence collected now might become more valuable in the future. The investigation into John Vancis continued to be a major focus. Despite the lack of direct physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, multiple factors kept him at the center of investigative attention. His relationship with Jodi, characterized by what appeared to be unrequited deeper feelings on his part, provided a possible motive. His lack of a verifiable alibi for the crucial morning hours created opportunity. His nervous behavior during interviews and his failed polygraph results suggested he might be hiding something. Investigators dug deeper into Vancis's background. They discovered he'd had previous relationships with younger women, a pattern that raised questions about his attraction to women significantly younger than himself. They learned about his lifestyle, his social connections, his daily routines. They interviewed people who knew him, asking about his temperament, his capabilities, whether they could imagine him committing violence. The picture that emerged was complex. Some described Vancis as harmless, a lonely older man who enjoyed the company of younger people. Others sensed something darker beneath the surface, an intensity that made them uncomfortable. One aspect of Vancis's connection to Jodi that investigators found particularly interesting was the timing of their last contact. Jodi had called Vancis on the evening of June 26, just hours before her disappearance. Phone records confirmed the call. When asked about this conversation, Vancis's account was that Jodi had called to let him know she'd be attending a golf outing and wouldn't be able to get together with evening, as they'd apparently discussed. It was, according to Vancis, a brief and unremarkable conversation. But investigators wondered if there was more to it. Had something been said during call that triggered a violent response? Had Vancis felt rejected or dismissed? Had Jodi perhaps established a boundary that Vancis found intolerable? Or had the call been exactly what Vancis claimed? A simple logistical conversation between friends. Without Jodi to provide her version of the conversation, investigators could only speculate. They also examined Vancis's activities on the day before Jodi's disappearance. Multiple witnesses placed him at various locations around Mason City. He'd run errands, interacted with people, behaved normally. Nothing about his demeanor that day suggested someone planning a violent crime. But investigators knew that people capable of terrible acts often appear completely normal in the hours before they commit them. The ability to compartmentalize, to present a calm exterior while harboring violent intentions, is a hallmark of certain types of criminals. On the morning of June 27th, after Jodi vanished, Vancis's behavior became a subject of scrutiny. When did he first learn about Jodi's disappearance? How did he react? What did he do in hours after she went missing? Investigators traced Vance's movements that day as carefully as possible. He claimed he'd heard about Jody's disappearance from television news reports and had immediately been worried about her. His phone records showed he made several calls that morning, some to mutual friends of his and Jody's, discussing the shocking news. What struck investigators as potentially significant was what Vance didn't do. He didn't call the police to volunteer information about his recent contact with Jody. He didn't go to Jody's apartment complex to see if he could help with the search. He didn't reach out to Jody's family to offer support. His response to learning that his close friend had been violently abducted seemed oddly passive to investigators. An innocent person might be expected to be more proactive, more visibly concerned, more eager to assist in any way possible. When confronted with this observation, Vance explained that he'd been in shock, that he hadn't known what to do, that he'd assumed the police would contact him if they needed information. His explanation was plausible. People react to traumatic news in different ways. There's no single correct way to respond when learning a friend has been abducted. But combined with the other questions surrounding Vance, his relatively passive response added to investigators' suspicions. The surveillance of Vance became more intensive. Detectives observed his comings and goings. They noted who he met with, where he went, what he did. They were looking for any unusual behavior, any indication that he might be connected to Jody's disappearance. They hoped he might lead them to evidence or even to Jody herself if she was being held somewhere. But weeks of surveillance produced nothing incriminating. Vance went about his life, appearing cooperative when investigators approached him directly, but offering nothing that advanced the investigation. While Vance remained a primary person of interest, investigators continued exploring other avenues. They looked closely at other men in Jody's life, examining relationships and interactions for any red flags. They investigated a man who'd reportedly made inappropriate comments about Jody at a social gathering. They interviewed someone who'd sent her fan mail that crossed into uncomfortable territory. They tracked down a former acquaintance who'd allegedly expressed jealousy over Jody's success. Each of these individuals was investigated thoroughly, their alibis checked, their backgrounds examined. None emerged as a stronger suspect than Vance. The investigation expanded geographically as well. Authorities in neighboring states were alerted to Jody's disappearance. Her photograph and description were distributed to law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Investigators considered the possibility that Jody had been taken out of Iowa entirely. Highway patrol officers were asked to watch for any sign of her, or for suspicious vehicles matching descriptions provided by witnesses who'd reported seeing unusual cars near Jody's apartment complex. Anonymous tips continued to flow into the police department. Some were clearly unreliable, products of overactive imaginations or people seeking attention. Others seemed more credible and required thorough follow-up. One caller reported seeing a white van near Jody's apartment complex around the time of her disappearance. Multiple other callers mentioned seeing similar vehicles in the area. Investigators tried to track down these white vans, but in a city the size of Mason City, there were numerous white vans owned by contractors, delivery services, and private individuals. Checking each one was time-consuming work that ultimately led nowhere definitive. Another tip that generated significant investigative attention involved a reported sighting of Jody in Minnesota weeks after her disappearance. A witness claimed to have seen a woman matching Jody's description at a rest stop, appearing disoriented or distressed. Police responded immediately, interviewing the witness and searching the area. But the lead didn't pan out. The woman the witness had seen was never identified, and there was no additional evidence to suggest it had actually been Jody. Still, every such report had to be taken seriously, investigated fully, because the alternative, dismissing a genuine sighting, was unacceptable. As summer turned to fall in 1995, the investigation showed no signs of reaching a resolution. The initial surge of tips and leads had been processed. The most promising suspects had been investigated without producing enough evidence for charges. The physical evidence from the crime scene had been analyzed without yielding a definitive identification of the perpetrator. Jody remained missing. The case remained unsolved, For Jody's family, the passage of time without answers was agonizing. Imogene Huisentrut, Jody's mother, struggled with the uncertainty, not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead, not knowing what had happened to her, not knowing who had taken her or why. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. The family held on to hope because they had to, because the alternative was unbearable, but as weeks turned into months, that hope became increasingly difficult to maintain. The television station where Jody had worked held a memorial service. Though there was no body to bury, no definitive proof that Jody was dead, the service was a way for the community to come together, to grieve collectively, to honor Jody's memory while still hoping she might somehow be found alive. Her co-workers spoke about her kindness, her professionalism, her bright spirit. Viewers who'd never met Jody in person attended, feeling connected to her through the television screen that had brought her into their homes every morning. The case attracted attention from national media outlets specializing in missing persons and unsolved mysteries. Programs like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries featured Jody's case, broadcasting her story to millions of viewers across the country. Each media appearance generated new tips, new possible leads, new hope that someone, somewhere had information that could crack the case. But the breakthrough never came. Investigators faced frustration at every turn. They had physical evidence from the crime scene, but it didn't point definitively to any suspect. They had persons of interest, but not enough evidence to charge anyone. They had hundreds of tips, but none that led to Jody or to her abductor. The case seemed to hover in a state of perpetual almost solved, with tantalizing possibilities that never quite materialized into actionable evidence. The partial palm print on Jody's key remained one of the most promising pieces of evidence. If investigators could identify a strong suspect, they could compare that person's palm print to the partial print and potentially exclude them or link them to the crime scene. But without a definitive suspect, the print couldn't independently solve the case. It was a piece of a puzzle waiting for other pieces to give it context. The drag marks documented in the parking lot suggested Jody had been pulled toward where another vehicle must have been positioned. Investigators worked to identify what vehicles had been in the apartment complex parking lot that morning. They canvassed residents, asking about their vehicles and whether they'd noticed any unfamiliar cars. They obtained information about vehicle registrations associated with that address. They tried to account for every vehicle that should have been there and identify any that shouldn't have been. But with multiple buildings and dozens of residents, plus potential visitors, the task was enormous and ultimately inconclusive. One question that haunted investigators was whether the attack had been sexually motivated. The violent nature of the abduction suggested passion or anger. The targeting of a young, attractive woman raised the possibility of sexual assault as a motive. But without recovering Jody or her remains, without evidence of what happened after she was taken from that parking lot, the question remained unanswered. If sexual assault was the motive, the perpetrator might have a history of similar crimes or might strike again. Investigators looked for patterns in other unsolved cases, searching for connections that might link Jody's abduction to other crimes. They examined cases of missing women in Iowa and surrounding states. They looked at unsolved sexual assaults. They reviewed reports of attempted abductions. They were searching for a pattern, a signature, something that might indicate a serial offender. The analysis didn't reveal any clear connections, but that didn't rule out the possibility. Many criminals begin with a single victim. Many crimes are isolated incidents rather than parts of a pattern. The lack of obvious connections to other cases didn't necessarily mean Jody's abduction was unique in the perpetrator's criminal history, only that no clear evidence that other crimes had been identified. The psychological profile of the likely perpetrator, developed with assistance from FBI behavioral analysts, suggested several possibilities. The targeted nature of the attack indicated someone with specific interest in Jody, rather than a completely random victim selection. The timing, occurring during a narrow window when Jody was vulnerable, suggested planning and surveillance. The successful execution of the abduction without witnesses or immediate detection indicated a certain level of competence and possibly experience with criminal activity. The profile suggested the perpetrator was likely male, probably between 25 and 50 years old, possibly someone known to Jodi or at least familiar with her routine. The boldness of abducting someone from their own parking lot suggested confidence, potentially arrogance. The lack of ransom demand or communication after the abduction suggested the motive wasn't financial. The overall picture was of someone driven by personal obsession or anger. Someone who felt entitled to control Jodi, someone who may have experienced perceived rejection or slight that triggered the violent act. This profile fits certain aspects of John Vance's, which is partly why he remained a focus of the investigation. But it could also fit numerous other individuals. Psychological profiles are useful investigative tools, but they're not precise instruments. They narrow the field of possible suspects but rarely identify a single individual definitively. As 1995 drew to a close 6 months after Jodi's disappearance, the investigation remained active but had slowed considerably. The initial intensive phase, characterized by round-the-clock work and hundreds of interviews, had transitioned into a more sustained but less frenetic effort. Investigators continued following up on tips and pursuing leads, but the early momentum had dissipated. The case was becoming cold. For Mason City, life had returned to a surface normalcy. People still went to work, still raised their families, still conducted their daily business. But beneath that normalcy lingered a sense of unease. The knowledge that someone in or near their community had committed such a violent crime, and had gotten away with it, was deeply unsettling. Women looked over their shoulders in parking lots. Parents warned their daughters to be more careful. The illusion of perfect safety had been shattered. The anniversary of Jodi's disappearance in June 1996 brought renewed media attention and renewed investigative efforts. Police held a press conference, appealing once again for anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that even small details, things that might not have seemed important at the time, could be crucial. They assured potential witnesses that any information would be treated seriously and investigated thoroughly. The anniversary also brought new searches. Volunteers once again combed through areas where Jodi might have been taken, or where her remains might have been concealed. Law enforcement coordinated efforts to re-examine locations that had been searched before, understanding that initial searches might have missed something, that changing seasons might reveal what had been hidden, that fresh eyes might see what others had overlooked. But the anniversary searches, like the original ones, produced no sign of Jodi. Wherever she had been taken, wherever she was now, the location remained a secret known only to the person or persons responsible for her abduction. The passage of time hadn't loosened any tongues. No deathbed confessions emerged. No guilty consciences prompted anonymous tips with specific actionable information. The secret held. Jodi's family established a foundation in her name, dedicated to helping solve missing persons cases and supporting families of the missing. It was a way to channel their grief into something productive, to honor Jodi's memory by helping others facing similar ordeals. The foundation raised money for investigative resources, provided support for families navigating the nightmare of having a loved one vanish, and worked to keep Jodi's case in the public eye. Imogen Huisentrut became an advocate for missing persons, speaking at events and to media outlets about the ongoing search for Jodi. Her pain was evident in every interview, every public appearance. But so was her determination. She refused to let her daughter be forgotten. She refused to accept that Jodi's case would remain unsolved forever. She pushed investigators, pushed media, pushed anyone who would listen, to keep working. Keep searching, keep trying to find answers. The Mason City Police Department assigned new detectives to the case as personnel changed over the years. Each new investigator reviewed the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses when appropriate, looked for angles that previous investigators might have missed. The case file grew thicker with each passing year, filled with reports, witness statements, tips, forensic analyses, surveillance logs, and investigative theories. But the file's thickness didn't correlate with progress toward a solution. Technology advanced, offering new possibilities for solving the case. DNA testing became more sophisticated. Databases of criminal offenders expanded. Computer systems allowed for better cross-referencing of information. Investigators submitted evidence for retesting as new techniques became available. They hoped that DNA invisible to 1950 technology might be detected and analyzed with newer methods. They hoped that fingerprint comparison algorithms might find matches that manual comparison had missed. Some of this retesting produced interesting results. DNA was detected on evidence that hadn't yielded results initially. But without a suspect to compare it against, the DNA profile sat in databases, waiting for a match that might never come. The advances in technology were promising, but they still required the crucial element of a suspect for comparison purposes. The case attracted attention from amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts. Internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries featured long threads discussing Jodi's disappearance. People analyzed the evidence publicly, proposed theories, debated the merits of various suspects. Some of this attention was helpful, keeping the case in public consciousness and occasionally generating new tips. But some was harmful, spreading misinformation or making unfounded accusations against people who had nothing to do with Jodi's disappearance. John Vancis, in particular, became the subject of intense speculation and accusation on these forums. His status as a person of interest became, in the court of public opinion, a conviction. People who'd never met him, who knew only what they'd read online or seen on television, declared him guilty. His life was dissected publicly. His every action was interpreted through the lens of assumed guilt. The harassment became severe enough that Vancis eventually moved away from Mason City, seeking privacy and escape from the constant scrutiny. But moving didn't end the suspicion. True crime documentaries featured Jodi's case, and in most of them Vancis was presented as the primary suspect. Investigators, speaking carefully to avoid legal liability, indicated he was a person of interest, but always emphasized that no charges had been filed. The distinction between person of interest and convicted criminal was often lost on the public. Vancis's life had been irrevocably altered by his association with the case, regardless of his actual guilt or innocence. Other individuals mentioned in connection with the case also faced public scrutiny and suspicion. Anyone whose name appeared in media reports about the investigation became subject to speculation and sometimes harassment. This created a chilling effect, making some potential witnesses reluctant to come forward with information for fear of becoming targets themselves. It was a difficult balance for investigators, needing public engagement and tips while trying to prevent vigilante justice and unfounded accusations. As the years stretched on, some people involved in the original investigation retired or passed away. Witnesses' memories faded. Physical evidence, despite careful storage, degraded. The case was becoming not just cold, but frozen, locked in time at June 27, 1995, with all the limitations of 1990s investigative technology and all the questions that remained unanswered. But the case never closed. The Mason City Police Department maintained an active file. A detective remained assigned to follow up on any new leads. The family continued advocating for attention and resources. And somewhere, perhaps in Mason City, perhaps somewhere else entirely, someone knew what had happened to Jodi Huisentruit. Someone knew where she was, someone knew who had taken her. And investigators continued to hope that someday, somehow, that someone would tell the truth. The investigation into Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance entered a new phase in the early 2000s, as advances in forensic science and investigative techniques offered fresh possibilities for solving cold cases. The Mason City Police Department, recognizing that the case required renewed energy and modern approaches, brought in additional resources and reconsidered evidence that had been collected years earlier. One significant development came from the evolution of DNA analysis. The biological samples collected from the crime scene in 1995 had been tested with the technology available at that time, producing limited results. But by the early 2000s, DNA testing had become exponentially more sensitive and sophisticated. Scientists could now extract usable DNA profiles from smaller samples, from degraded material, from evidence that would have been considered useless a decade earlier. Investigators submitted key pieces of evidence for retesting using these advanced techniques. Items that had touched Jodi's attacker during the struggle, items that might contain trace amounts of the perpetrator's DNA, were sent to specialized laboratories. The scientists worked meticulously, knowing that this evidence represented perhaps the best chance of identifying who had taken Jody from that parking lot. The retesting yielded results. DNA profiles were developed from evidence at the scene, profiles that hadn't been obtainable in 1995. But the crucial question remained: whose DNA was it? Without a suspect in custody to compare against, the profiles were entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders in crime scenes. Investigators hoped for a hit, a match that would identify the person whose genetic material had been left at the scene of Jody's abduction. The CODIS search didn't produce an immediate match. This meant that whoever's DNA was present at the scene either hadn't been convicted of a crime that required DNA submission, or hadn't had their DNA entered into the database for some other reason. It was disappointing but not entirely surprising. CODIS is a powerful tool, but it's not comprehensive. Many people, including those who have committed crimes, aren't in the database. Still, the DNA evidence represented a significant asset. If investigators could identify a strong suspect through other means, the DNA could potentially confirm that person's presence at the crime scene. It could be the final piece of evidence needed to charge and convict Jody's abductor. The challenge was identifying that suspect in the first place. John Vancis remained the most prominent person of interest, and investigators approached him about providing a DNA sample for comparison. Through his attorney, Vancis declined. He was under no legal obligation to provide a sample absent a court order, and his attorney advised against voluntary cooperation. This refusal fueled public suspicion even further. Online forums erupted with speculation about why an innocent person would refuse to provide DNA that could exclude them as a suspect. But from a legal perspective, Vancis's refusal was understandable. Providing DNA voluntarily when one is a suspect in a major crime investigation could only potentially harm his position. If the DNA matched, it would be devastating evidence against him. If it didn't match, it might only exclude him from having left that particular sample, but wouldn't prove his innocence overall. As there could be multiple perpetrators, or the DNA might not be from the perpetrator at all. His attorney was protecting his client's interests, which is exactly what defense attorneys are supposed to do. Investigators attempted to obtain Vancis's DNA through other means. They conducted surveillance, hoping to collect items he discarded that might contain his DNA. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin, anything Vancis touched and threw away could potentially provide the sample they needed. But this kind of collection is complicated. Chain of custody issues can arise. Questions about privacy rights and proper procedures can affect whether such evidence would be admissible in court. And Vancis, aware he was a suspect and likely aware of such collection techniques, was presumably careful about what he discarded in public. The investigation also revisited other suspects and persons of interest from the original investigation. Several men who'd been investigated in 1995 were re-interviewed in the 2000s. Investigators asked them to voluntarily provide DNA samples. Some cooperated, their samples were tested, and they were excluded as sources of the DNA found at the crime scene. Others refused, exercising their legal right not to incriminate themselves, which kept them in the pool of possible suspects even if investigators had no other evidence against them. Beyond DNA, investigators looked for new witnesses or new information from old witnesses. People's situations change over time. Someone who was protecting a friend or family member in 1995 might be willing to tell the truth years later after relationships have deteriorated. Someone who was afraid to speak up initially might find courage with the passage of time. Someone who didn't realize the significance of what they knew might come to understand its importance years later. The police department issued new appeals for information, emphasizing that it was never too late to come forward. They assured potential witnesses that even if they'd remained silent for years, even if they'd lied to investigators initially, coming forward now with the truth would be viewed favorably. They wanted information more than they wanted to prosecute people for obstruction. They wanted to solve Jody's case more than they wanted to punish those who'd hindered the investigation years earlier. These appeals generated some response. A few individuals came forward with information they'd withheld previously. Most of it was minor, details about seeing Jody in the days before her disappearance, observations about people in her life, small pieces that added texture to the investigation but didn't crack the case. One person did provide information that generated significant investigative interest, however. This witness reported that they'd seen a suspicious vehicle near Jody's apartment complex in the early morning hours of June 27, 1995. The vehicle was colored van, possibly white or tan, and it had been parked in a location where it could observe the parking lot where Jody's car was located. The witness had thought it odd at the time, a van sitting there in the pre-dawn darkness, but hadn't reported it immediately because they weren't certain of its significance. This information corroborated earlier tips about a white van in the area. Investigators worked to identify who owned such vehicles in Mason City in 1995. They cross-referenced vehicle registrations with lists of suspects and persons of interest. They tried to determine if John Vances had access to such a vehicle. They investigated whether any other suspects owned or could have borrowed a light, colored van. The van lead proved frustratingly difficult to pursue. Many people and businesses owned white or light-colored vans in 1995. The witness's description wasn't specific enough to narrow it down to a particular make or model. And even if investigators identified a specific van, proving it was the one at the scene and connecting it to Jody's abduction would require additional evidence that might not exist after so many years. Another avenue of investigation that received renewed attention involved Jody's social circle and the possibility that someone she knew casually had become obsessed with her. Investigators compiled lists of everyone Jody had encountered in the months before her disappearance. They reviewed her calendar, her phone records, her credit card statements, trying to identify everyone she'd interacted with. They re-interviewed coworkers, asking if they remembered anyone showing unusual interest in Jody or asking questions about her. This painstaking review revealed some names that hadn't been thoroughly investigated initially. Men who'd attended the same social events as Jody. Someone who'd worked on a project at the television station and had opportunities to observe her. A viewer who'd sent several letters to Jody expressing admiration. Each of these individuals was tracked down and interviewed. Most were eliminated as suspects. Some provided DNA samples that excluded them. Others had solid alibis for the morning of Jody's disappearance. A few remained persons of interest but without enough evidence to charge them. The geographic profile of the case was also re-examined. Where had Jody been taken after being abducted from her parking lot? The complete absence of any trace of her despite extensive searches suggested either that she'd been taken far from Mason City very quickly, or that whoever took her knew the area extremely well and knew where to conceal her or her remains in a location that wouldn't be searched. Investigators studied maps of the area, identifying potential disposal sites. They looked at properties owned by suspects and persons of interest. They examined areas of new construction from the mid-1990s, considering the possibility that Jody's remains might have been buried at a construction site and subsequently covered by buildings or pavement. They researched lakes, rivers, wells, abandoned buildings, rural properties, anywhere a body might have been hidden. Some of these locations were searched again with more advanced equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, which had improved significantly since the 1990s, was used to scan properties where Jody might have been buried. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains even years after death, were brought in to search areas of interest. Divers explored bodies of water that hadn't been thoroughly searched initially. The efforts were extensive and expensive, but finding Jody remained a priority. These searches didn't locate Jody or her remains. Each failure was discouraging, but investigators persisted. They understood that finding Jody, even finding her remains, would be crucial not just for bringing her home to her family, but for building a prosecutable case against whoever had taken her. Without a body, without physical evidence of what happened after the abduction, proving murder would be extremely difficult even if they identified a suspect. The case attracted renewed media attention periodically, especially around anniversaries of Jody's disappearance. Television shows continued featuring the case, each presentation reaching new audiences and potentially jogging someone's memory. Newspaper articles revisited the investigation, summarizing progress and renewing appeals for information. The coverage kept Jody's name in the public consciousness, ensured the case wasn't forgotten, and maintained pressure on investigators to keep working toward a solution. Jody's family remained actively involved, their determination undiminished by the passage of years. Imogen Huizentrut, despite advancing age and declining health, continued advocating for her daughter. She gave interviews on anniversaries, she attended vigils. She met with investigators whenever they requested. Her strength in the face of such prolonged anguish inspired many, and served as a constant reminder that behind the case files and evidence bags was a real family experiencing real pain. The psychological toll on Jody's family was immense. The uncertainty of not knowing what happened, not knowing where Jody was, not having a place to grieve, created a unique form of suffering. Families of murder victims can at least lay their loved ones to rest, can visit a grave, can have some form of closure even as they grieve. Families of the missing have none of that. They exist in a state of perpetual limbo, unable to fully mourn because there's always the infinitesimal possibility that their loved one might still be alive somewhere. For Jody's family, this limbo was compounded by the public nature of the case. Their private grief played out in newspaper articles and television specials. Strangers on the internet debated theories about what happened to Jody, often with callous disregard for the family's feelings. Well-meaning but intrusive questions from community members who recognized them in public added to the burden. There was no escape from the tragedy, no private space to grieve away from the public eye. The investigation also examined potential connections to other crimes. Were there other missing women whose disappearances might be related to Jody's? Were there unsolved murders with similarities that might suggest a common perpetrator? Investigators looked at cases in Iowa and neighboring states, searching for patterns. They found some cases worth examining more closely. Several women had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in the upper Midwest during the 1990s. Some had been found murdered. Others remained missing. Investigators compared details: the age and appearance of the victims, the circumstances of their disappearances, the geographic locations, the methods used if known. They were looking for signatures, for common elements that might link cases to a single perpetrator. The analysis didn't reveal any definitive connections. Each case had unique elements. The circumstances varied enough that linking them convincingly was impossible. But investigators couldn't completely rule out the possibility of a connection either. Serial predators often vary their methods and target different types of victims. The absence of obvious connections didn't mean Jody's abductor had only struck once. One case that received particular scrutiny for possible connections was the disappearance of another young woman from a different Iowa city around the same time period. Like Jody, she'd vanished without a trace. Like Jody's, her disappearance appeared to be an abduction rather than a voluntary departure. Investigators compared evidence from both cases, looking for similarities in DNA, fiber evidence, or method. The comparison didn't produce any matches, but the cases remained open to the possibility of connection if new evidence emerged. The investigation also had to contend with false leads and hoaxes. Some individuals, seeking attention or for reasons known only to themselves, provided false information about Jody's case. Someone claimed to know where Jody was buried and led investigators on a wild goose chase to a rural location where nothing was found. Another person falsely confessed to involvement in Jody's abduction, wasting valuable investigative resources before their story fell apart under questioning. These hoaxes were more than mere annoyances. They consumed time and resources that could have been devoted to legitimate leads. They gave false hope to Jody's family, who would learn about a potential break in the case only to have that hope crushed when the lead proved false. And they complicated the investigation by adding more noise to the signal. More information to sort through and evaluate. Investigators developed protocols for evaluating tips and leads more efficiently. They established criteria for determining which information was worth pursuing intensively and which could be set aside. They created systems for tracking which leads had been followed, what the results were, and what remained to be done. The case management became increasingly sophisticated as the volume of information grew. By the mid-2000s, the investigation had generated a massive amount of documentation. Thousands of pages of reports, interview transcripts, forensic analyses, and investigative notes filled multiple filing cabinets. Digital storage helped manage some of this information, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. Reviewing all of it thoroughly would take weeks or months. Yet any detail anywhere in those files might be the key to solving the case. New detectives assigned to the case faced the daunting task of absorbing all this information. They had to understand not just the facts of the case, but the context of each piece of evidence, the reasons why certain leads had been pursued and others set aside, the personalities and relationships of the various people involved. It was like trying to understand a complex novel by reading it one page at a time out of order. Despite these challenges, fresh perspectives sometimes revealed things that previous investigators had missed. A new detective might notice a connection that hadn't been obvious before. They might approach a witness differently and elicit new information. They might see significance in evidence that had been considered unimportant. This is why cold case units value bringing in new investigators periodically, even though it requires them to climb a steep learning curve. One area that received renewed investigative focus was the question of whether Jody had been specifically targeted or had been a victim of opportunity. The evidence suggested targeting. The timing of the attack, the apparent knowledge of Jody's routine, the specific location chosen. But some investigators wondered if this interpretation was correct. Could the perpetrator have been in that parking lot for another reason entirely, encountered Jody by chance, and made a split-second decision to abduct her? This theory seemed less likely than targeted selection, but it couldn't be completely dismissed. If the abduction was opportunistic, the pool of suspects expanded dramatically. It might not have been someone obsessed with Jody specifically, but rather someone who was in that parking lot for another purpose, saw a vulnerable woman alone in the pre-dawn darkness, and acted on impulse. This possibility meant investigators had to consider suspects who might not have any obvious connection to Jody at all. The investigation looked at who else lived in or had access to Jody's apartment complex. Were there residents with criminal histories? Had anyone in the complex been accused of harassment or violence against women? Were there maintenance workers, delivery people, or others who regularly had legitimate reasons to be in the parking lot? This line of inquiry produced several persons of interest who were investigated and ultimately cleared, but it was a necessary avenue to explore. Another question investigators wrestled with was whether there might have been multiple perpetrators. The abduction happened quickly and apparently without sustained noise that would have drawn attention. Could one person alone have subdued Jody, gotten her to a vehicle and driven away, all within the narrow window of time available? Or would this have been easier with two people, one to control Jody and one to manage the vehicle and assist with moving her? The evidence didn't definitively answer this question. The drag marks suggested Jody was pulled across the pavement, which one strong person could accomplish. But two people would have made the task easier and faster. The lack of witnesses and the apparent efficiency of the abduction could support either a single perpetrator who acted decisively or multiple perpetrators who coordinated their actions. If there were multiple perpetrators, the investigation became even more complex. It meant identifying not just one person but potentially two or more. It meant considering whether the perpetrators knew each other previously or came together for this specific crime. It meant the possibility that someone out there had knowledge of what happened, but wasn't the primary actor. Perhaps just an accomplice who was struggling with guilt or fear. Investigators made appeals specifically aimed at potential accomplices. They emphasized that someone who was involved, but didn't commit the actual violence, might receive more lenient treatment in exchange for information. They tried to create wedges between hypothetical co-conspirators, hoping that if multiple people were involved, one might be willing to turn on the others to save themselves. These tactics sometimes work in criminal investigations, but in Jody's case, they didn't produce results. The financial aspects of the investigation were significant. Cold cases are expensive to work. The laboratory testing alone costs thousands of dollars. Surveillance operations consume personnel hours. Travel to interview witnesses or follow leads adds up. The Mason City Police Department's budget was limited, and dedicating extensive resources to a single case, however important, meant other cases received less attention. Jody's family helped address this by raising funds specifically for the investigation. They held fundraisers, accepted donations, and used the money to pay for additional forensic testing or to hire private investigators to supplement the official investigation. Private investigators brought fresh perspectives and sometimes had more freedom to pursue certain lines of inquiry than official police investigators. Their work was coordinated with law enforcement to ensure it didn't interfere with the official investigation. One private investigator hired by the family focused specifically on John Vancis. They investigated his background more thoroughly, interviewed people who knew him, tried to identify any prior concerning behavior that might not have been in official records. They looked for patterns in his life that might suggest capability for violence. They tried to place him at the crime scene through witness interviews or other evidence. This private investigation produced some interesting information about Vancis's life and relationships, but nothing that definitively connected him to Jody's abduction. He'd had complex relationships with other younger women, which was consistent with what police already knew. Some people who knew him expressed discomfort with his intensity, but discomfort isn't evidence. The private investigators' work kept pressure on Vancis and kept him in the public eye as a suspect, but it didn't crack the case. Vancis, for his part, maintained his innocence. In rare public statements, usually through his attorney, he insisted he had nothing to do with Jody's disappearance. He expressed frustration at being treated as a suspect based on what he characterized as circumstantial evidence and speculation. He pointed out that no physical evidence linked him to the crime scene, that he'd never been charged with anything, and that the presumption of innocence should apply to him as it would to anyone else. His arguments had legal merit. In the American justice system, people are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Being a person of interest in an investigation isn't the same as being charged with a crime. Without sufficient evidence to charge him, Vancis remained legally innocent regardless of what investigators or the public might suspect. This frustrated many people following the case, who felt certain of his guilt but understood that feelings and certainty aren't the same as evidence that would stand up in court. As the investigation progressed into the 2010s, nearly 2 decades after Jody's disappearance, the case took on new dimensions. The world had changed dramatically since 1995. Social media had transformed how information spread and how people engaged with unsolved mysteries. True crime had exploded as a genre with podcasts, streaming documentaries, and online communities dedicated to analyzing cold cases. Jody's disappearance found new audiences, new amateur investigators, and new public pressure for resolution. The Mason City Police Department faced this renewed attention with mixed feelings. On one hand, keeping the case in the public eye was valuable. Tips still came in, and some proved worth investigating. The pressure ensured the case remained a priority and that resources continued to be allocated to solving it. On the other hand, the intense scrutiny sometimes complicated investigative work. Witnesses became hesitant to speak with police when they knew their statements might end up discussed on internet forums. Suspects lawyered up immediately, aware that anything they said would be analyzed by thousands of amateur sleuths online. The department created a dedicated website for the case, providing information about Jody's disappearance and offering a direct channel for tips. They established a special tip line that was monitored regularly. They assigned a detective to specifically manage information coming in through social media and online sources. The investigation had to adapt to the new media landscape, using modern tools while maintaining traditional investigative rigor. One significant development came from advances in genetic genealogy. This technique, which had successfully solved other cold cases like the Golden State Killer investigation, offered new possibilities for identifying perpetrators through DNA. The method involved taking DNA evidence from a crime scene and comparing it not just to databases of convicted offenders, but to public genealogy databases where people had uploaded their DNA results to find relatives. Investigators worked with genetic genealogy experts to determine if the DNA evidence from Jody's case could be used in this way. The process was complex and required DNA of sufficient quality and quantity. It also required navigating legal and ethical questions about using DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. But if successful, genetic genealogy could potentially identify a suspect even if that person's own DNA wasn't in any database. By identifying their relatives and using family trees to narrow down to the perpetrator, the genetic genealogy analysis was initiated with cautious optimism. Scientists uploaded the DNA profile from Jody's case to genealogy databases, searching for matches. They were looking for close relatives of the person who'd left DNA at the crime scene, people who'd share significant genetic markers. From there, professional genealogists would build family trees, identifying individuals who fit the profile of the suspect and who could have been in Mason City on the morning of Jody's disappearance. The process took time. Months of painstaking work went into analyzing matches, building family trees, and narrowing down possibilities. Investigators followed this work closely, hoping it would finally provide the breakthrough they'd sought for decades. But they also had to be patient. Genetic genealogy wasn't a quick fix. It was methodical work that couldn't be rushed. While the genetic genealogy work progressed, traditional investigation continued. In 2017, a major development occurred when local media reported that investigators had identified a new person of interest in the case. This individual, whose name was initially withheld from public reporting, had connections to Mason City in 1995 and had come to investigators' attention through a combination of new witness information and re-examination of old evidence. The announcement sent ripples through the community and through the online true crime community that had been following Jody's case for years. Who was this new suspect? How did they connect to Jody? What evidence implicated them? The police department released limited information, as is typical during active investigations, which only fueled more speculation. Eventually, more details emerged. The person of interest was someone who had lived in the area at the time of Jody's disappearance. They had a criminal history that included violence. Witnesses had placed them in proximity to Jody's apartment complex around the relevant time period. The combination of factors made them worthy of serious investigative attention. Investigators interviewed this individual extensively. They sought and obtained search warrants for properties associated with them. They collected DNA samples for comparison against evidence from the crime scene. They built a timeline of this person's activities on 27/1995, looking for gaps that couldn't be accounted for. Times when they could have been at Jody's apartment complex. The DNA comparison was crucial. If this person's DNA match would have been found at the crime scene, it would be powerful evidence of their involvement. The samples were sent to the laboratory for analysis. Investigators waited for results, knowing this could be the moment the case finally broke open. Jody's family waited too, hoping after more than 20 years that they might finally get answers. The DNA results came back. They did not match. The person of interest was excluded as the source of the DNA evidence from the crime scene. This was devastating to investigators who would finally have identified Jody's abductor. It was another dead end in a case that had produced far too many of them. But exclusion is also information. It meant this particular individual, despite other concerning factors, was not the person who'd left DNA at Jody's crime scene. Unless there were multiple perpetrators, which remained possible, or unless the DNA at the scene was from someone other than the abductor, which was less likely but not impossible, this person could be ruled out. The investigation moved on, but the disappointment lingered. The focus shifted back to previously identified persons of interest, including John Vances. By the 2010s, Vances was in his 70s. He'd lived for decades under the shadow of suspicion in Jody's disappearance. The public discussion of the case almost always mentioned him as the primary suspect, even though he'd never been charged. His life had been irrevocably shaped by his association with the investigation. Investigators approached Vances again, hoping that the passage of time or perhaps declining health might make him more willing to talk. They emphasized that they wanted the truth, that providing information now could help bring closure to Jody's family. They appealed to whatever conscience or humanity existed in him. But Vances, through his attorney, declined to cooperate further. If he knew anything about Jody's disappearance, he wasn't sharing it. The question of Ances's guilt or innocence remained unresolved. Some investigators who'd worked the case over the years remained convinced he was responsible. They pointed to his relationship with Jody, his lack of alibi, his failed polygraph, his refusal to provide DNA. They believed the evidence, while circumstantial, pointed clearly to him. Other investigators were less certain. They noted that suspicion isn't proof, that refusing to cooperate with police is a constitutional right, and that being the primary suspect in a high-profile case when you make anyone cautious about further involvement. The truth was that without physical evidence definitively connecting Vances to the crime scene, without witnesses who saw him there, without a confession, prosecutors couldn't charge him. The standard for criminal prosecution is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Suspicion, even strong suspicion, isn't enough. The gap between believing someone is guilty and being able to prove it in court has frustrated investigators in countless cases, and Jody's was no exception. One avenue investigators explored was the possibility of identifying Jody's remains through advances in search technology. Ground-penetrating radar had become more sophisticated. Drone technology allowed aerial surveys of large areas that would have been impractical to search on foot. Satellite imagery analysis could identify disturbed earth or other anomalies that might indicate burial sites. These technologies offered hope that Jody might be found even if her abductor was never identified. Specialized search teams were brought in to survey areas identified as possible disposal sites. They focused on properties connected to suspects, remote rural areas within a reasonable drive from Mason City, construction sites from the mid-1990s that might have provided opportunities for concealment. The searches were systematic and thorough, using multiple technologies to maximize the chances of detection. One search in particular generated significant hope. Ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a buried object of appropriate size on a rural property that had connections to a person of interest. Excavation equipment was brought in. Investigators and forensic anthropologists stood by, prepared to carefully excavate if human remains were discovered. The dig proceeded carefully, layers of soil removed methodically. Everyone aware that this could be the moment Jody was finally found. But it wasn't Jody. The object detected by the radar turned out to be an old septic tank, long since filled in and buried. The disappointment was crushing. Each false alarm, each search that produced nothing, took an emotional toll on everyone involved, particularly Jody's family. Yet they had to continue. The alternative, giving up the search entirely, was unacceptable. Imogene Huisentrut, Jody's mother, passed away in 2014 without ever learning what happened to her daughter. She'd spent 19 years searching for answers, advocating for Jody, refusing to let the case be forgotten. Her death was a profound loss not just for her family, but for everyone who'd followed Jody's case. Imogene had been the public face of the family's pain and determination. Her presence at vigils and press conferences had been a constant reminder that behind the investigative details was a mother who desperately wanted her daughter home. Imogene's death without resolution was a tragedy compounded by tragedy. She'd never been able to bury her daughter. She'd never gotten justice for what happened. She'd died with the same questions that had haunted her since June 27, 1995. For those working on the case, Imogene's death added urgency. They'd failed to give her the answers she deserved while she was alive. The least they could do was continue working to solve the case in her memory. Jody's father, Maurice Huisentrut, and her sister continued the family's advocacy after Imogene's death. They maintained the foundation established in Jody's name. They continued giving interviews and attending events related to the case. They kept pressure on investigators and kept the case in the public eye. Their determination was remarkable, evidence of a family's unbreakable bond and refusal to let their loved one be forgotten. The case attracted attention from high-profile advocates for missing persons. John Walsh, host of America's Most Wanted, featured Jody's case multiple times over the years. Each feature reached millions of viewers and generated tips that investigators had to evaluate. Some true crime podcasters did extensive multi-episode series on Jody's disappearance, analyzing the evidence in detail and interviewing people connected to the case. These presentations kept the case alive in public consciousness, and sometimes uncovered new information through the interviews they conducted. One podcast series in particular generated a tip that led investigators to re-examine a specific aspect of the case. A listener contacted police after hearing the podcast, claiming they had information about a vehicle they'd seen near Jody's apartment complex on the morning she disappeared. This witness had never come forward before, because they hadn't realized the significance of what they'd seen. The podcast's detailed description of the crime scene and timeline helped them understand that what they'd witnessed might be important. The tip was investigated thoroughly. The witness was interviewed multiple times, asked to describe the vehicle in detail, questioned about their certainty regarding the date and time. Their account was specific enough and consistent enough to be taken seriously. Investigators worked to identify vehicles matching the description, cross-referencing with lists of suspects and persons of interest. The lead didn't ultimately solve the case, but it demonstrated how renewed public attention could shake loose information that had remained hidden for decades. In 2018, the Mason City Police Department announced they were conducting another round of searches for Jody's remains. Using information from various sources, including tips received over the years and analysis of suspect behavior patterns, they identified several locations worthy of intensive search. The announcement brought media back to Mason City, cameras recording as search teams mobilized. One location that received particular attention was a rural property that had been owned by someone who knew Jody. The property had changed hands several times since 1995, and the current owners were cooperative with the search. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were conducted. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Specific areas where the earth appeared to have been disturbed were carefully excavated. The search team worked methodically, aware that decades in the ground would have reduced remains to bones, making detection more difficult but not impossible. The search lasted several days. Media camped nearby, reporting on the progress. Online communities followed every development, analyzing photos and videos from the scene, debating what the search might reveal. Jody's family waited anxiously, hoping this would finally be the search that brought Jody home, while simultaneously dreading the confirmation that she was indeed dead. But once again, the search produced nothing. No human remains were found. No evidence of Jody's presence at that location was discovered. The search teams packed up their equipment and left. The property returned to normal, and the question of where Jody Hosentrut was remained unanswered. These repeated disappointments raised difficult questions. Was Jody even in Iowa anymore? Had her abductor taken her far from Mason City before killing her and disposing of her remains? Was she buried somewhere so remote or so well hidden that she might never be found? Or was it possible, however unlikely, that she was still alive somewhere, held captive or living under a different identity with no memory of her past life? The last possibility seemed nearly impossible. Jody's face had been publicized extensively. If she was alive and functioning in society, someone would have recognized her. And cases of long-term captivity, while they do occur, are exceptionally rare. The more time passed, the less plausible it became that Jody was alive. Yet without remains, without definitive proof of death, that sliver of possibility couldn't be completely eliminated. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that Jody's remains might have been destroyed in a way that made recovery impossible. Bodies can be disposed of through methods that leave little or no trace: incineration, dissolution in chemicals, dismemberment followed by disposal in multiple locations. These possibilities were grim to contemplate, but investigators had to consider them. If Jody's abductor had used such methods, she might never be found, regardless of how thoroughly investigators searched. The psychological profile of the perpetrator was revisited and refined based on accumulated knowledge about the case. Behavioral analysts considered what the crime itself revealed about the person who committed it. The level of planning suggested someone organized and methodical. The ability to keep the secret for decades indicated someone with strong self-control and possibly someone who'd committed crimes before. The targeting of Jody specifically suggested someone with personal feelings about her, whether obsession, rejection-based anger, or sexual fixation. The profile suggested the perpetrator was likely someone who appeared normal on the surface. They might have jobs, families, social connections. They'd managed to avoid detection for decades, which meant they hadn't engaged in behavior that drew police attention for other crimes. They were intelligent enough to leave minimal evidence and disciplined enough not to confess or brag about what they'd done. This profile fit aspects of several suspects, but it also described countless people who had nothing to do with the crime. By 2020, 25 years had passed since Jodi's disappearance. The anniversary was marked with special coverage from media outlets and a renewed push from investigators for information. 25 years felt significant, a quarter-century of Jodi being gone, a quarter-century of her family living without answers, a quarter-century of someone getting away with a terrible crime. The press conference held on the anniversary was somber. The police chief spoke about the department's commitment to solving the case. The lead detective reviewed the state of the investigation and made appeals for anyone with information to come forward. He emphasized that it was never too late, that even 25 years later, tips were being investigated and the case remained active. Jodi's family members spoke about their ongoing grief and their determination to find answers. One point the detective emphasized was the likelihood that someone out there knew something. In cases like this, perpetrators sometimes confide in others. They tell a girlfriend or boyfriend. They mention it to a cellmate during a later incarceration for a different crime. They let something slip while drunk. Someone somewhere likely knew something about what happened to Jodi Huisentruit, even if they didn't realize the significance of what they knew or were afraid to come forward. The detective made specific appeals to people in various situations. If someone's father or husband or friend had shown unusual behavior on or after June 27, 1995, if they'd had unexplained scratches or injuries, if they'd soiled or destroyed a vehicle suddenly, if they'd shown unusual interest in the case or unusual knowledge about it, that information could be crucial. If someone had been told something in confidence years ago and had kept that secret, now was the time to speak up. The promise was made that people who came forward would be treated with respect and that their cooperation would be valued. These appeals generated some response. Several people called in with information about individuals who'd behaved strangely around the time of Jodi's disappearance. Most of these tips were thoroughly investigated and led nowhere. People behave strangely for many reasons that have nothing to do with abducting news anchors. But each tip had to be evaluated, because any one of them might be the crucial piece of information that cracked the case. The investigation also had to contend with the reality that time was running out for some potential witnesses and suspects. People who were 40 or 50 years old in 1995 were now in their 60s and 70s. Some had died. Others were in declining health. If someone had information that could solve the case, they might not be alive or competent to provide it much longer. This added urgency to the investigation, a sense that the window of opportunity to solve the case might be closing. John Vancis was in his 80s by the 2020s. His health had declined. He'd lived his entire later life under the cloud of suspicion in Jodi's disappearance. If he was innocent, the injustice of that suspicion was profound. If he was guilty, the knowledge that he'd gotten away with it for decades must have been a burden he carried alone. Either way, time was running out for answers from him. Investigators made final attempts to approach Vancis, hoping that proximity to death might loosen his tongue if he had information to share. Sometimes guilty people want to clear their conscience before they die. Sometimes innocent people want to make one final statement of innocence. But Vancis remained silent on the subject of Jodi's disappearance. If he had secrets, he appeared prepared to take them to his grave. The genetic genealogy work that had been initiated years earlier continued, though progress was slow. The matches found in genealogy databases had led to family trees being constructed, but narrowing down to specific individuals who could have been in Mason City on the relevant date was challenging. The work required both genetic expertise and traditional genealogical research, tracing family lines through multiple generations, identifying descendants who matched the age and geographic profile of the suspect. Several individuals identified through this process were investigated. Most were quickly eliminated through alibis or other evidence. A few remained persons of interest who couldn't be completely excluded. Investigators worked to locate these individuals, interview them, and if possible, obtain direct DNA sample for comparison. The process was painstaking and time-consuming, but it represented one of the best hopes for finally identifying Jody's abductor. As the investigation moved deeper into the 2020s, the case of Jody Huisentruit remained one of Iowa's most haunting unsolved mysteries. 3 decades had passed since that June morning, when Jody vanished from her apartment parking lot. 3 decades of questions without answers. 3 decades of a family searching for their daughter. 3 decades of someone carrying the terrible secret of what really happened. The passage of time had transformed the investigation in fundamental ways. The original detectives who responded to the scene in 1995 had long since retired. Many witnesses had died. Physical evidence had degraded despite careful preservation. The world itself had changed beyond recognition. The pre-internet era of 1995 feeling like ancient history compared to the hyper-connected present. Yet the core questions remained unchanged. Who took Jody Huisentruit from that parking lot? Where did they take her? What happened in the hours and days after her abduction? And most fundamentally, where is Jody now? The physical evidence collected in 1995 remained preserved in climate-controlled storage, waiting for the technology that might finally unlock its secrets. The DNA profiles, the fiber evidence, the partial palm print, all of it cataloged and maintained with the hope that advancing forensic science would eventually provide answers that earlier technology couldn't deliver. Some cold cases had been solved decades after the crime through DNA evidence that yielded nothing when first tested. Jody's case could be next. The Mason City Police Department maintained its commitment to solving the case. A detective remained assigned to follow up on tips and pursue new leads. The case file, now filling multiple boxes and digital storage drives, was reviewed periodically by fresh eyes looking for connections that earlier investigators might have missed. The department's website dedicated to the case was updated regularly, ensuring that new generations encountering Jody's story had access to information and ways to provide tips. Jody's family continued their advocacy, though the toll of decades without resolution was evident. Maurice Huisentruit and Jody's sister carried forward the work that Imogen had started, keeping Jody's memory alive through the foundation established in her name. They spoke at events for families of missing persons, sharing their experience and offering support to others facing similar nightmares. Their strength in the face of such prolonged suffering inspired many. The true crime community's interest in Jody's case never waned. New podcasts examined the evidence. Documentaries presented updated investigations. Online forums debated theories and analyzed suspects. This sustained attention kept pressure on investigators and kept Jody's disappearance in public consciousness. Somewhere in all that discussion, in all those thousands of hours of analysis and speculation, the truth existed. Someone knew what happened. Someone always knows. John Vancis remained the most prominent suspect in public discussion, though he'd never been charged and had always maintained his innocence. His advancing age and declining health meant that if he possessed knowledge about Jody's disappearance, time was running out for that information to emerge. Investigators continued monitoring him, hoping for a deathbed confession or some final piece of evidence that would definitively establish his guilt or innocence. But Vancis remained silent on the subject that had defined his later life. Other suspects and persons of interest identified over the years were tracked as well. Some had died. Others had moved away from Iowa. A few remained in the area, living under the shadow of suspicion to varying degrees. Without sufficient evidence to charge anyone, these individuals existed in a legal limbo, neither cleared nor convicted. Their lives forever touched by their connection to one of Iowa's most notorious unsolved crimes. The genetic genealogy work continued, perhaps the best hope for a breakthrough. The technique had solved other cold cases that seemed hopeless, identifying perpetrators who'd evaded justice for decades. If the DNA from Jody's crime scene was of sufficient quality, and if the right matches could be found in genealogy databases, it might finally reveal who took Jody from that parking lot. Searches for Jody's remains continued as well, though less frequently than in earlier years. When credible tips came in suggesting specific locations, search teams were dispatched. When new technology became available that might detect what earlier searches had missed, targeted areas were surveyed again. The hope of finding Jodi and bringing her home to her family never completely died, even as the years made that outcome seem increasingly unlikely. The impact of Jodi's disappearance extended far beyond her immediate case. Her story had heightened awareness about the dangers faced by women, particularly those in public-facing professions. It had demonstrated how quickly safety could be shattered, how violence could intrude into the most ordinary moments. It had shown that even in small, supposedly safe communities, terrible things could happen. For Mason City itself, Jodi's disappearance remained an open wound. The community had never fully recovered from the shock of losing someone they'd welcomed into their homes every morning. The knowledge that her abductor had never been caught, might still be among them, created lasting unease. Parents warned their daughters to be careful. Women checked their surroundings more carefully, parking lots. The innocence of a simpler time had been lost. The investigation would continue. Tips would still be followed. Evidence would be retested as technology advanced. New witnesses might emerge. Genetic genealogy might identify a suspect. Someone's conscience might finally compel them to reveal what they knew. The case would never be closed, never be forgotten, never be abandoned. Because somewhere Jodi Wasentruit waited to be found. Whether buried in Iowa soil or taken far from the state she loved, whether her remains rested in a known location or a place yet to be discovered, she existed somewhere in the physical world. And somewhere someone knew the truth about what happened to her. The hope remained that justice would eventually come, that Jodi's family would finally get answers, that whoever took her from that parking lot would be held accountable, that the mystery that had haunted Iowa for decades would finally be solved. Until that day, investigators would keep working, Jodi's family would keep advocating, and the world would keep asking the same questions that had echoed through the years since June 27, 1995. What happened to Jodi Wasentruit? Where is she now? And when will the truth finally emerge from the darkness? Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.